Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Toy, and I'm an MBA student at MIT Sloan. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel, When the Odds Don't Add Up, Navigating Anomalies and Uncertainties in Sports Betting. Our panelists today are Jeff Ma, Chief Digital Officer at Troon and co-host of Bet the Process, Nate Silver, statistician, author, and founder of the Silver Bulletin, and Sean Zerillo, senior writer at the Action Network. Our panel will be moderated by Chad Millman, co-founder of the Action Network. The panel will run for 40 minutes, and we will save 5 minutes at the end for questions. Please submit questions via our Cadence app. With that, I'll turn it over to Chad. Thank you.
Good morning. Great to see everybody. Thanks for coming out. I'm excited about this panel because this past NFL season was historic in terms of betting. It was so historic that multiple publicly traded sportsbook operators had to make announcements at earnings calls in the second half of the year that they were reducing their revenue projections by hundreds of millions of dollars because of what they termed customer-friendly outcomes. Essentially, customers were winning too much money. And the reason for that is because favorites were winning and covering at an historic rate, at a rate that hadn't been seen in close to 45 years. For those who don't bet very often, when favorites win, it's bad for the sports books, but it's also not great for people who are professional bettors. Professional bettors are often making most of their money by betting on underdogs. So as the season went on, this became a little bit more chaotic and was wreaking a little more havoc in the betting community. So I'm excited to have this panel today and these experts today because I wanted to get their take on how do you manage that kind of chaos in the moment when your models are telling you one thing and the reality is something that is entirely different. So Sean, I want to start with you. A couple years ago in baseball, this scenario happened.
Whether this is like a big deal or not first?
I think it is a big deal. And I'll get to you, Jeff. I know you want to instigate.
No, I'm not instigating. I just think we have to put this in context, like putting in historical context and throwing out numbers that have no context around what the actual outcome should have been. 71% is a great number, but what should the actual outcome have been? Do you know?
Well, I didn't
closing
say 71%.
lines? What's that?
Hold on, I'll get to you.
Okay.
I'll get to you. Sean, years ago in baseball, they started putting baseballs into humidors. You had no idea where it was going to be. The commissioner could do it at his sort of own discretion. How do you manage a scenario like that where you don't know all the circumstances and it's changing in real time?
Yeah, in 2020, the pandemic shortened season, remember this took place only during the summer. MLB was making changes to try to reduce the number of balls leaving the yard, increase the balls in play. So they secretly installed 3 humidors at parks, but didn't tell anybody where, didn't tell anybody that they had done it whatsoever. And we didn't actually find it in the data until after the fact because those unders weren't profiting at those 3 parks. It was Citi Field, Fenway Park, and T-Mobile Park. Those unders only hit at a 46% rate in that short season. But the following year, MLB added 5 more secret humidors, and they didn't tell anybody about them. And those 5 parks, in hindsight, crushed in April in terms of hitting the under, may eventually regress. But aside from talking to people who actually work with these teams, figuring out by process of elimination whether they have them or not, you can look at the data, look at the batted ball data, the trajectory, launch angle, exit velocity, and try to figure out the outlier batted balls after adjusting for weather and where they're not flying as far. But something else that's super important that's worth pointing out, as MLB was messing with these humidors, installing them, they also were changing the baseballs constantly every year. And you can go on Baseball Savant and see the drag coefficient data spike and then go back down. In 2019, MLB set a record. They hit close to 6,600 home runs, I believe. It's 1,400 more than there were last season, more than half a home run per game compared to last season. But every year, MLB's been messing with the baseball. And in 2022, which is the particularly important year, they uniformed installed humidors across all 30 parks, but they also kept the baseballs that they had changed to at the end of the 2021 season. In April, Unders hit at a 60% rate. We also had super cold weather in April. So I think there was this confluence of factors. It wasn't just the humidors. It wasn't just the new baseballs, which they had put into play at the end of last season. And they were using 2 batches of baseballs, by the way, at the end of 2021. But it was also the super cold weather in April that we had as well. So the confluence of factors just made the unders absolutely boon for a month. It ended up regressing a little bit in May because the books sort of over-adjusted, knowing that people were looking to bet unders. And then the past 2 years, they've gone to more of a hybrid baseball, and you've seen that home run to fly ball rate sort of level off between the juice baseballs and the dead-end baseball.
Nate, Jeff, I promise I'm going to get to you next. I know you want to pull up.
I'm good.
But Nate, you're shaking your head at this. You're recognizing sort of the chaos in the middle of this situation. How do you make adjustments like that?
I mean, first of all, you want to remember whenever you have a model of some kind that it's representing the real world. And so when things change in the real world, they should change in your model too. So we just published our new Silver Bulletin college basketball ratings yesterday. So I spent past 2 weeks looking at NCAA men's for now. We'll do the women later. Tournament data, which is rich data like baseball. You have 364 Division I programs. So there are thousands and thousands of games every year. You can be pretty robust, whereas NFL can be more of a guessing game by contrast, right? And like what we found is that the system that we designed first a few years ago, we're now enhancing it, was under-predicting upsets early in the season. And the reason why is because if you go all the way back to 1950, you have college athletes will stay for 3 or 4 years, and now they don't, right? There's less carryover from season to season, and so that's a adjustment we made. That factor is now flexible, right? We also have a factor that's like flexible for like home court advantage, which by the way is much larger for some college teams than others, like Duke or Purdue, or high altitude teams. And so the more you have fixed parameters in your model that you think are empirical, but are actually based on backfitting data and aren't flexible, that makes you vulnerable to people who are sharper in picking up on trends, right? And obviously there can be noise. If you have the unders hitting in baseball in April, is that because of changes in weather, which are temporary, or changes in the baseball, or change the nature of the game, right? And you want to, baseball, you have enough data to disaggregate that, but your work is never done in modeling. The same thing with election stuff, where more and more in congressional elections, partisanship rules everything else, right? You're not going to have a Democrat winning an upset in an R+10 state, whereas you might have had that 10 years ago.
So, Jeff, before you reject the premise of the idea, you have been betting for a long time. You're steeped in the gambling world. When you have a model that you have been working on, and there start to be changes over the course of a season, it could be college basketball, could be NFL, how do you decide when there is a legitimate change that you need to make versus this is just a trend that is probably going to regress back and my model is accurate?
I mean, I think it's important to understand like the context of these two different things we're talking about because they're very different, right? One, you're talking about market data, right? Where essentially the market data is, betting is a market, right? And markets tend towards efficiency, which means that over time they change, right? So if you use market data, it's always gonna be non-stationary, it changes, right? So all these, that's why I hate all these trends that you see like 7-1 against the spread, all that kind of stuff. It's just BS, it doesn't mean anything at all, right? Now, if you talk about what Sean's talking about, which is a fundamental change in underlying data that you use, that is a huge deal, right? And that is ultimately like something that you have to understand. Now, if we go back to this, the premise of this panel, and I do think it's a big deal, but my point is more, we have to put this into context, right? Because ultimately, favorites, you say favorites won 71% of the time, they should have won about 66% of the time. My esteemed podcast colleague, Rufus Peabody, ran this for me this morning, and the actual chance of this being random was about 9%, right? So it's not a total outlier event. I mean, it is a reasonably, but again, like this is based on market data, and so when I think about something like this, I want to say like, so what, right? And meaning like, what will this change for me as I think about it? So I think about like, okay, why would this have happened? Why could this have happened, right? And why would the market have been this way? And you think about a little bit the way that sports betting has changed with legalization, and you have probably more efficient markets, meaning you have ability now very easily to go from Circa, which is a sharp book, to DraftKings, which is a soft book. And those lines have to be very similar now, otherwise there's arbitrage. So you don't have a situation where previously, you know, like the sharper people, the sharper books were different, right? And so maybe that makes it such that, you know, favorites have become something to bet on because it's just, you know, like that becomes more prevalent across books where like certain books can't protect against that and juice the favorites up anymore because, you know, the sharper people can get down on them. So again, like the context to me is important in this, and ultimately, like what's more interesting to me is thinking about things that Sean is talking about. Your question about how do you think about, like this happens all the time in betting. So I'll give you guys an example that's very different. So when I was a professional blackjack player for a long time, and there was a time that back in the days in the mid-90s, when new casinos were opening up everywhere, we would go to these new casinos and we would play blackjack at them. And there was one in Chicago called the Grand Victoria in Elgin, Illinois, and it opened, and it was an unbelievable game for blackjack. There were 40 different tables that you could walk around, and there was the $2,000 limits at all the tables, and it was great. We went there probably 4 or 5 times and just got our ass kicked. We kept losing and losing and losing, to the point where it was like a significant standard deviation event where we were, you know, we thought maybe they were cheating. So we went in there and we actually sampled decks. We didn't play. We went and counted the decks just to see if it was a normal sample. Like if you're a card counter and you count the decks and they're cheating, that means they probably take some 10s out or some aces out. And if you count, you will know at the end, you know, most decks should eventually end up at 0, or like the distribution should be ending up at 0. And we went in and it was normal, right? But we had a hypothesis. We went and tested it, and it was normal, right? So like if you go back to this NFL season, you need a hypothesis about why this is happening, and then maybe you can go test it. But again, like market data, markets tend towards efficiency, and this year I will almost bet that it won't happen again.
So that was my next question. I'm glad you bring that up because I know a lot of people in the betting community who are trying to figure out, and a lot of this did normalize during the playoffs, right? Things that were happening during the regular season went a little bit back to normal during the playoffs. But I know a lot of people are trying to figure out, okay, we're now heading into an offseason where there are rule changes that have dramatically impacted the way the game is played and the way decisions are made and how coaches are thinking about their decisions on the field when in sort of high leverage situations, or will it revert back? And so how do you think about over the next 3, 4, 5, 6 months what you've done in the past and incorporate what happened last year? Or do you just completely take it off the table and say, this was an aberration and it's going to go back? Jeff, I'll start with you and we'll come back around.
Again, like when you say what happened this year, like that doesn't mean anything to me. Like, you know, like again, like if you talk about Sean's, you know, humidor example, and there's tons of examples in sports where rule changes and things like that. You know, like last year, they just talked about it on the NBA panel. Last year, in the middle of the year, right, they don't readily admit this, but they changed the rules, right? A foul became different. I don't know if you guys remember, there was like, everyone was talking about it being prison ball, and like unders started to hit, and the scoring just started dramatically going down and down and down. And that was like a paradigm shift that had happened in the underlying game, right? If I think about this NFL season, is there a paradigm shift that's happened in the NFL this year? Like, is there a disparity in talent that are like, what is the reason, right? And ultimately, again, we're talking about market data, meaning like we're talking about how they did versus the market. And to me, that's a much harder thing to chase down. And I don't think I'll do anything. I don't think I'll actually like care about that in terms of like, I mean, I'll again think a little bit for this panel on why that might happen, but you know, adjusting based on that is not, I mean, you always incorporate market data in any model you do, but like, so the market data will impact that.
I mean, doing nothing is still a choice though, right? It's a hypothesis that says, we think this is noise and the market might be wrong about it. But yeah, this is where kind of the art and the skill and the domain knowledge come in a little bit, right? There's a trend, you're trying to detect whether the trend is real or not, and you have some intuition from many years of betting or doing analogous things about like, when is it significant or when isn't it significant, right? Or by the way, if you have a model, another important thing, let's be honest, is to detect for when did I design my model wrong, or is there a bug or some incorrect data, right? Being able to catch that quickly before it publishes is always nice. And you know, that's where the experience comes in a bit. I've found, I'm doing less sports betting now, more playing poker, and like I found over the past couple of years, doing really well in cash games, not very well in tournaments, right? Is that a fluke, or is that say something about my game? I'm not sure, because in poker, like anything else, right, a couple big pots going differently can have a pretty large effect, especially in a tournament where you get eliminated. But that's the kind of thing that you have to be hypothesis-driven and say, okay, if I'm doing better in cash games, maybe it's because I'm getting a little bit older, right? In cash games, I choose when I play. Maybe it's because my opponents are a lot softer. I'm doing better game selection. Maybe my approach is better. So thinking through the what and the why is the kind of nexus of this.
Well, look, these models are art and science, right? It's only as good as your inputs. It's only as good as the creativity that the person who's making them brings to the model. So Sean, how are you making adjustments year to year? To Jeff's point, how are you determining what is market data that might be a little bit noisy versus some actual signals that you need to incorporate?
Yeah, let me give 2 examples. So April 2023, underdogs absolutely got destroyed in baseball. I believe they lost at a 15% ROI for the month. And I had people telling me this is a sport of haves and have-not now. We have teams that are better, teams that are choosing to be worse, less teams that are trying to compete going into the year. But then things flipped in May. And the whole time I said, this is just variance, this is a random outcome, it's 1 month. Baseball is 7 times more variant than football, right? Or some scale of multiplied. And I kept saying it's gonna revert, it's gonna revert. But you look at something like the Guardian Stadium last year, overs were flying earlier in the season. There seemed to be no reason why. It's always been kind of a pitcher's park. And then you realize the Guardians made a fundamental change to their stadium in the offseason. They did some renovations, not to the fences, but to the outfield concourses, and they removed some shipping containers. And overs wanted a 60% clip through August, and then people caught on to this, people started talking about this wind tunnel effect, and then they went 1-12 in September. So once the market caught on to it, once people caught on to it, people started trying to bet into the trend, but the trend had already been assessed for and adjusted for, and then people were betting into what was an over-adjusted trend against them at that point. So I think it's really interesting to look for some fundamental reason, as Jeff said, some fundamental rule change or some fundamental difference in the way the game might be playing out. Just looking ahead to next year with the ABS system potentially being implemented in baseball, I think it could have an impact on the increase of the run environment. Baseball is trying to, become more efficient with regards to called strikes, but all these efforts they've made to put more balls in play, when you implement the ABS system, maybe you end up going back towards a more of a 3 true outcome approach where hitters are taking more walks. They're taking their A swing more aggressively on pitches that they know are in the zone that are not borderline pitches. They're taking more borderline pitches. So you may see some fundamental changes in the way the game is played and outcomes just a result of this one rule change that's not actually intending to cause those effects.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so important that this is not academic work where you can wait until you prove something to some high degree of statistical significance and then you start betting it, right? By that time, the market's already figured it out. And in fact, you may be over-adjusting or under-correcting or whatever else. And so can you figure this out kind of the first time you take a look at the data? And that requires some intuition and some guts. But yeah, your edges might last for a couple of weeks nowadays.
Yeah. 3 weeks.
I mean, we've kind of talked about this concept on our podcast quite a bit. It's this hypothesis-driven betting, right? Where I think traditional sports betting you could beat basically by looking at historical data and building a model and being better than the market because the market was inefficient in certain areas. Now that's less the case. I think the markets are becoming much more efficient, especially the main markets. And we've had a guy on named Judah Fortgang who is a genius at beating same-game parlays. Everyone would say same-game parlays are, not they're a fool's errand. But he does what we call hypothesis-driven betting, where he essentially has a hypothesis about a game and how that game will play out, and things that are thought to be negatively correlated are not negatively correlated, like different reception shares or different. And in the Super Bowl, there was, the thought, just to put it in context, was the hypothesis-driven was hey, maybe this story of the Eagles winning on the ground is not necessarily true. And they're going to have to go pass, and Jalen Hurts is going to have to be a big part. So your same-game parlay could have been like Jalen Hurts MVP with Saquon Barkley unders, and that idea that how those correlations work out, and if you can price them better. But this is the thing, and to Nate's point, which I think is an awesome point. This is not academic work. You can't have this the same rigor and expect that you're going to be able to get an edge. Sometimes you have to take a shot on things, and that is incomplete with like kind of incomplete data. Like again, Sean, your point around, I'm sure you have ideas of what the ABS will do, and you're going to probably, like, my question to you is like, how aggressive will you be early on in betting that stuff and trying to bet those edges? Because to Nate's point, like, if there is an edge that happens, it will be gone soon once people realize what's happening.
Yeah, you always have to balance the need to be, or the desire to be directionally correct with the need to wait for a statistically significant sample, right? So let's say I think the adjustment should be A, but because I don't have the sample to prove it yet, although we do have minor league data that you could use to compare, right? You could use that as your example, but I think what I would do probably is a quarter measure or half measure, where you're not making the full adjustment, you're making a slight adjustment in the direction that you think it's likelier to go based off of that hypothesis. And then once you have more sufficient data, you can make the more accurate adjustment from there. So I think it's okay to be directionally correct sometimes when you think there may be a fundamental change. It may cause you, in some circumstances, to be on the wrong side of that adjustment. But I think by and large, once you've been doing this for a long time, I think it's proper to make those adjustments based upon the hypotheses you form.
Sean, you just said something about shipping containers in the concourse in the outfield. Who realized those shipping containers had been moved? And how did that news spread without the community?
Yeah, Jose Ramirez hit a home run to right field that was one of the slowest hit balls ever to leave the park. And I think that started tipping people off of like, why was this ball able to get out even with the wind? The wind wasn't particularly strong that day, but it just crept over the wall. And it's like, no batted ball here has ever gotten out of the park at this trajectory. So they started looking into more data for batted balls that were going out there, and it seemed like there was a different path for the ball flight than there was in prior years. And fans started sending in videos of them removing the shipping containers, and it became very obvious that there was this wind tunnel effect out to right field. So anecdotal, right? You know, people noticed it who had been at the stadium in previous years. They were posting videos of it, but they didn't know the intended effect until we actually saw it play out for 3 or 4 months, and we got enough data that showed the ball actually flying to that trajectory.
So that's a great anecdote to both what Nate and Jeff were saying, that these are not academic exercises, that at the end of the day, you're creating these models that are both creative and hypothetical, and you need to have ideas, but you need to be able to be flexible in how you're thinking about these things. Nate, how often are you looking at yours to make
I mean, look, so the best recent outlier example I can think of in election models is last year, late in the campaign, a poll came out from a very well-reputed pollster called Seltzer that had Kamala Harris winning Iowa, which she did not win. She lost Iowa by 13 points, I think, right? And the model handles it well in the sense the model's like, okay, not a lot of Iowa polls, but we have a strong prior. She's not going to win Iowa, and it's one poll. We'll average it in, and doesn't actually affect the top line by more than 1% or whatever, right? But from a hypothesis standpoint, I'm not somebody to tinker with the model structure in mid-October, right? It's like way too late. But in terms of writing about it and thinking about for future years, like that data point means either all the other polls are really wrong, or this very traditional way of doing polls is kind of broken. So like that's a case where if I were betting directly on it, I want to think, what's that hypothesis mean in the kind of, because obviously you can like mean revert and be Bayesian and kind of squish it in, and that is fine as far as when you're ingesting hundreds of data points a week, but to look and say like, okay, how did this slow hit ball become a home run in this park? First of all, you have to make sure that the data isn't an anomaly, something wrong with the way the data was tracked or wind speeds or something else, but that should cause you to like re-examine things. Or if you're fitting a player rating system like I have in the NBA, like, okay, why does the system think that Kevin Durant is not as good as the consensus, right? Is that true about Kevin Durant? I don't know. People are pretty smart about basketball. Maybe it means that I'm accounting for something wrong in that iterative process.
It's like the Wayne Winston example way back from the day, right? So I think what's interesting about this whole, like, what you're saying, right, ultimately is what is in, like, understanding, like, what is in the market and what isn't in the market. Like, what factors are already in the market and what factors aren't. Because, like, one of the areas I think is interesting is, like, how much weight should you place into the market, right? So if you go back to this idea of markets tend towards efficiency, if you build a model and your model is 10% off the market, then you need a new model because it's probably wrong. Unless you are seeing something that no one else is seeing, right? And that comes back to this idea, Sean, you're talking about like of directionally correct versus absolutely correct. But the idea that, again, like when you build a model and it's way off market, you need to have an understanding of why it's an hypothesis of why it is off market. Like there is something in your model. And again, like if you really believe in it, then you bet the crap out of it because you've got a real edge. But you got to be very careful because markets are good. Like they are smart. As much as we like to think there's dumb people betting, the markets tend towards efficiency and they are stronger probably than anything that you can build from a model perspective.
Well, especially now, right? To the point about these are efficient markets and there are more people betting than ever. So if you identify, Jeff, a 10% difference in sort of what you think versus what the model thinks, how do you determine your confidence level in something like that?
I mean, again, like I think if your model's that off, you've got to look and see why and really understand why. And I think you have to always be, and this goes back to like the original question, which I think like gamblers face this kind of stuff all the time. When you lose, like nobody likes to lose, and when you lose a prolonged amount of time, which you will do if you gamble professionally, like you will have losing streaks, I guarantee it. It causes you to reevaluate everything, right? Rufus and I talked about this on Bet the Process. He says when he wins a lot too, he's always reevaluating. Like this whole idea of, the challenge I think with betting, again, is this stuff is non-stationary, right? You're like rules change, things happen, and so you have to always be reevaluating it. And I think it is like the $1 million question, which is, when do you feel like you maybe have lost your edge, right? Like we used to bet college football second halves, and for about 6 or 7 years, we were winning at a great rate. And then the last couple of years, we've been losing. And we've been, I think 2 years ago we got killed. Last year we were around 50%, which obviously isn't enough to win. And so we've had to understand, are we going to continue doing this? What is the underlying thing? And there have been some rule changes with the clock in college football over the last 2 years where they run the clock in a different way. And I think that may have screwed up the way that we look at scoring differences in the first half versus the second half. But again, like I think you're always reevaluating, or otherwise you're bad at your job. And like when you lose, that really does cause you to just sort of like say, what's going on here?
Yeah, in the 2020-23 NBA season, I think it was, I bet the whole regular season kind of as an experiment for the book and taking it pretty seriously, maybe a couple hours a day. And I'm a big NBA fan, so like it's not just taking the model out of the box, it's putting things into context, looking for better lines, etc. And I did very well, very, very well at the start of the season, and very well after the trade deadline, and then not very well otherwise. So you come out, I had $2 million of handle, and I made like literally like $6,000 or something for the year, right? And I think the reason why, first of all, it can always be a fluke. These are not huge sample sizes, right? Because I think our player ratings are actually pretty good and probably beat the market to some degree, but everything else, we are behind the market, right? We have some entering in data on injuries, which is not nearly as accurate or precise as someone else, right? Trying to figure out in the NBA regular season what the motivation of teams are from game to game, trying to read, So like when that thing that you have an edge on is prominent at the start of the year, the teams are scrambled, trade deadlines, teams are scrambled, and like knowing how valuable players are is valuable. 90% of the time in the NBA, that doesn't really win out, right? So maybe next time, I'll just bet the start of the season, the trade deadline, and then ignore the rest because I'm not doing the work to like keep track of injuries and lineup changes that I need to beat the lines at other times.
I just want to talk about the injury angle or the motivation angle with regards to the NFL thing we were talking about earlier. So looking at the NFL data from this year, underdogs did fine in September, but October they got significantly worse. It's almost like once teams went 0-2, 0-3, they stopped trying. And Jeff, I just wanted to ask with regard to that 67% expected win rate or whatever it was, looking at our data, I believe this was the 4th best ROI ever for money lines, despite it being the highest win rate. So was this the highest expected win rate for NFL favorites ever this year? It had to be one of the highest,
I don't
second
know.
highest.
We didn't run that.
So that begs the question to me is the NFL becoming a less parity-driven league? Are teams trying less? There's no draft lottery. It's the only league without a draft lottery. Once teams go down 0-2, 0-3 in a season, are they trying less? Is there any motivation to play well from that point forward if you know you're not going to make the playoffs?
Again, like I I think you got to be really careful in overreacting to, like the funny thing about the NFL is it's a small sample size league.
Absolutely.
There's 200 whatever games. That's it, right? Like imagine trying to build a model off of that amount of occurrences. It's so, you kind of always in any model you want to break things down into underlying things where you get more occurrences, and so. People that do NFL modeling are breaking things down into play-by-play typically, which is like the smallest unit that you can get of an occurrence, and that's how they build things up. So, again, like I'm not thinking about market data and shaping how I bet. I'm thinking about underlying data and building a model. And again, one of the things again that I didn't bring up when you brought up the Seltzer data, the Seltzer whatever poll, I think it's interesting to look at that in retrospect. Because if that did have a really big impact on most betting markets, right? Like it had Poly Markets, give you guys a shout out. Like that had a big impact. But there were a lot of people that bet into that change with the conviction that Trump was going to win, right? There's stories of the guy that like did the neighbor polling or whatnot.
Yeah, and I mean the difference is like I consult for Poly Market among other things I do. I don't think political betting markets are that smart because people are so like pilled on election stuff, right? You have more dumb money.
But
in
I think
politics,
you generally have a bias against markets broadly. Like you had a bias against markets, sports betting markets, until you became a sports bettor for a year.
I think
a little bit.
Look, I think markets are hard to beat, right? So you have to think about where the money is coming from, and like you can probably still make money on the Super Bowl, the NCAA tournament, big events where you have a lot of the ratio of dumb money to smart money is off. And like for elections, that's still true. But I can tell you, knowledgeably that like certainly you have investment banks and hedge funds and every concern on Wall Street, they see political risk as more and more of a factor in every type of commodity or equity that they're trading, right? And so they're getting more serious about pricing it in. I think places like Polymarket now have like real volume with low transaction fees that change this. So I think it's getting more efficient. But yeah, my training is that like actually markets and politics involve a lot of groupthink and a lot of wish casting where people like they bet on the outcome they want to see. In general because Democrats are more neurotic and like risk averse, right? And especially for things that are like crypto adjacent or betting adjacent, like they tend to have a slight GOP lean relative to what the models say. But who knows? They've been right, basically, in 3 out of the past 4 elections to have that GOP lean, or 2 of the last 3, at least, which is like a very small sample size. I mean, talk about like a maddeningly small sample size, right? We get 1 election every 4 years, not 220 games or whatever it is. And so you have to be very hypothesis-driven, I think, and try not to be too results-oriented.
Well, I mean, again, like if you go back to the person that, I don't know if any of you guys heard the story, I forget the guy's name, but the person that bet a lot of money on Trump, what he ended up doing was basically trying to get his own data. He created his own polling data by, instead of polling people directly, he asked people who they thought their neighbors would bet on, would vote for, with the idea that most people wouldn't tell the truth, i.e. if they were going to bet on Trump or not. And there was this bias, inherent bias in polling data against Trump. And so I think the lesson of that is ultimately to beat these things, one of the best ways to do it is to create a data moat. Have data that nobody else has, which is, it's almost impossible in sports, but like if you can do that, that's when you create real, like all the modeling is commoditized, right? Like I can go to ChatGPT and have it build me a model, right? But like you actually like the idea of the creativity around building a model, but also just the underlying inputs, that's kind of the key to all this, and having those hypotheses that can drive these models.
Yeah, and that being more robust in an AI world where like data becomes kind of the most valuable resource, including having data sets that are like well curated and well maintained, right? It may not be original data, but like if you have anomalies in your data, right, you're going to have real adverse selection problems where you're starting to bet on those anomalies. And so, so having better data set, we've always kind of been on the view, we'll give away the data, but the model is proprietary, right? Maybe it should be the reverse. Show you the code. Probably in a few years you can build, I somewhat disagree with that, but you can probably build decent models with LLMs and other AI tools, if not now, within a few years. But having a data moat will retain a lot of value.
There's plenty of data out there. I just wanted to interject.
Yeah.
There's plenty of data out there regarding UFC fights and how UFC fights finish on a year-to-year basis. And last year, the finish rate plummeted in UFC by 8%. It was the highest decision rate in 15 years, 20 years. Now, they changed the gloves going into the year in an effort to try to reduce eye pokes. That was the intention of the rule change, but ultimately the knockout rates plummeted. Now, if you're just going off of that standardized data across the entire UFC, you say, okay, maybe the gloves caused that decrease. But you start realizing, well, the UFC changed their roster size. You have to break this down by division. Every division has a different finish rate. The UFC now only has 30 heavyweights on their roster. They basically cut half of their heavyweight roster, so you're going from 4 heavyweight fights a month to 2 heavyweight fights a month. And heavyweights have the highest finish rate in the sport. Historically, it's close to about 70%. So if you're replacing all of those heavyweights with 135-pound fighters who go to decision 55% of the time, but you're just looking at the entire data sample across the entire organization, you're not going to see the fact that the roster changed, and that's probably why the knockout rate decreased, not the glove change.
I want to remind people, if you have questions, now's the time to get them in. I'm going to start asking them in a few minutes, but I think it's really interesting. When people hear model, they automatically assume that model means a very high percentage of success. And Nate, you've written about this often, you know, in On the Edge, your book that came out this summer. You described probabilistic thinking and probabilistic results, and that's different than, I think, what the public expects when you put out data and information based on a model. Explain, like, what the expectation is versus what the reality is.
Yeah, I mean, you know, fundamentally, if you haven't had like tractable experience where you're actually making bets or dealing with probabilistic outcomes, where there's a penalty for being wrong in either direction, right? If there's a penalty for saying something is 90%, when it's really only 80% over the long run, which you experience in like poker or sports betting, for example, you can like bet the other side. You can bet your 10 to 1 if it's really only 5 to 1. Apart from that, for most people, it's hard to get that. In some ways, I've kind of given up on trying to like explain to people who aren't kind of in this world. I guess it's like part of why, as a business strategy, we put the probabilities behind the paywall, right? You want this, you got to pay for it, right? And also, it's self-selecting for an audience that is more inclined to understand it. Again, it's worse, and I think sports fans inherently understand that there is some degree of quirkiness or flukiness, right? If a pretty well-thrown ball tips off the receiver's hand, it becomes a pick six. I think they understand that wasn't like willed by God necessarily, right? Whereas in politics, people think, oh, what happened was the righteous outcome that must have happened. They ignore the fact that, like, you know, random events. Last summer, we had a bullet that hopefully, or, you know, fortunately, narrowly grazed President Trump's ear instead of doing something much worse, right? And like, if the wind had been slightly different, all of American history is profoundly different. And like, people need to understand the nature of chance and contingency in the real world too. And like, and the backfilling, it's like the French whale, you know, he did collect original data by doing this neighbor polling, right? It's also a technique that's been used in the past and didn't particularly add value in the past. So he's collecting data, but also like you're fitting a narrative to like, this one n equals 1 outcome, right? And you have to be careful about that too. We're very good at like telling stories to backfill the trend we see in the data.
Yeah, I mean, there's like two things here, right? Like confirmation bias that you're bringing up, I think, is real, but that's also like broadly what I'm talking about with this panel, right? Like this whole premise of this could be confirmation bias, where we're fitting a narrative to something that was like a 9% chance of happening anyways. What I think is interesting, if you think about just this concept of, you know, markets and kind of where you're going, or where we've gone with like political markets, is this idea again, like where does the edge come from going forward in like political markets? Like what are the things you're going to do now to change, you know, this idea? Because like actually what I was going to say is, the thing that you're really bringing up is this idea that like people can't think probabilistically, they always think deterministically, right? Like people generally have a hard time understanding, like, you know, like the first year with the Trump stuff, like everyone gave you shit because they said that you were wrong, but you were directionally much more correct than any of the models, right? Yeah. And I was always standing up for you saying like, no, Nate was like the most right, even though he wasn't right, you know? So this idea of like understanding probabilities and what they mean, like people in this room understand it, but these people, you guys are not representative of the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, you have these two trends that are kind of maybe not in conflict, but create interesting dynamics, right? Where on the one hand, yes, people get smarter, AI models become more efficient, Wall Street invests more money in political prediction, maybe even some hedge funds do sports prediction and stuff too, right? On the other hand, you have this like increasing amount of groupthink where asset prices like rocket around all the time based on basically memes and based on clusters and of trying to like outthink the other guy and so you see like prices that seem like anomalous. I mean, GameStop and things like that is one example, but so in a world, I mean, I think we're going to be in a world where you have to like understand. It's almost like in poker, where you have GTO, which is game theory optimal. If everyone's playing right, here's how you minimize your loss, right? In that world, you don't make money, you just minimize your loss. And here is my exploit. And understanding exploits it's not gonna be enough just to have a model. It's understanding why is the market different from my model, and the answer, if you have a really bad model, is that your model sucks, right? If you have a really good model, then you have an interesting hypothesis, right? And that's kind of where the bread and butter is made, because market dynamics can get out of hand.
There's a question in here that I want to ask that is about sports books working on replacing traditional modeling techniques with AI kinds of models or inputs and using AI to be more efficient. But to me, the question is really about, for all three of you, an increase in the public and the volume coming in and the public having access to this kind of data and information. It's all been democratized over the past 20 years through the internet, but now it's becoming something where everybody, Jeff, I think you said earlier, like, you can take a model through AI and do it pretty easily. Does that worry any of you in terms of your ability to operate more effectively? Sean, I'll start with you.
I think it's very clear that the betting market as a whole has gotten more efficient since sports betting legalization. I mean, especially if you're taking a top-down approach, as Jeff alluded to earlier, you're going to see less of a discrepancy from one book to the next. You're not going to be able to pick off soft lines, and if you do, you're probably going to get banned at those books in pretty short order. So I think generally speaking, the access that people have in terms of being able to create their own models, the access people have in terms of being able to enhance their own models. I don't come from a coding background. Everything I've done, I've learned on my own. So being able to, implement things like Monte Carlo simulations, right? Or learning other techniques that I can implement into Excel in order to upgrade my process for preseason projections. It's just going to make everybody smarter. It's going to make the general public smarter in terms of their ability to put data together, to combine it, and then also to look for findings based upon, big data sets of analysis. Once AI gets, I think, even a little bit better than this, a year from now, I think we're going to see exponential increases. So yeah, I just think it makes the general public smarter, which is only going to sharpen up the markets. And I don't know how much sharper they can get, because it already feels like everything's gotten very efficient and the edges are becoming more difficult to find.
Jeff?
I mean, I think it's the hypothesis-driven betting that's probably the opportunity, i.e. like things that you believe aren't in the market. And that's ultimately, I think the days of the, build a model based on, publicly available data, have a better model than other people, have small edges, I think those days are kind of over, because I think the market is getting too efficient when that. So I think like the derivative markets, meaning like prop bets or, any of the like not necessarily standard markets where the market is very efficient, right? So NFL sides, NFL totals, very efficient. First halves become a little bit less efficient. Quarters become even more inefficient. Like you got to go to these. The problem with this is it's harder to get a lot of money down in the derivative markets, but that's probably where the edges are going to come from more, and it's going to be based on you having a hypothesis that in this derivative or in this smaller market that there's an edge.
Yeah, I mean, there's both the operator side and the bettor side. From the bettor standpoint, to a first approximation, I think, yes, AI will make it harder, and it's already very hard to make a profit sports betting. That's the kind of top-line answer, right? I do think both from operators and from bettors, there are some guys in one of my poker games that like have some machine learning transformer model they built for like, I guess, the NFL, and don't think they really understand. They're smart guys, don't really understand how it works, right? And they had a fantastic 2023 and then a terrible 2024. And I'm like, okay, but if you don't really understand kind of what the model's doing, then all you can really do is just trust it and then say, okay, well, we've lost enough now where statistically it's a significant change. And so like there'll be bad models out there. The reason, by the way, that sports books are reluctant to use AI is that if you get the one hallucination that the model might have, or the one really big mistake that isn't human checked, can leave you very vulnerable, right? Like I was using ChatGPT, which I'm very impressed by LLMs. I think people underrate them, right? I was running a poker hand through it, and it didn't recognize that like a player had made a straight, which is something any elementary poker player could do, right? If you have that equivalent of that kind of bug in your sports book, and people jump on this line really fast, then that creates a big vulnerability for you.
I mean, I think what you're saying even more is, just to expand on that, is this idea of like that we talk about a lot of black box modeling in sports betting. It's a really bad idea in my mind, because you need explainability, because then when, to bring back to the whole crux of this conversation, like it's really hard to understand why your black box model is wrong, right? And so ultimately, like explainability around a model in sports betting is really important.
We're out of time. Great conversation, Jeff, Nate, Sean. Jeff, I feel like you've already previewed what the panel next year is going to be on hypothesis betting. So I'm excited about that. Thanks, everyone, for jumping in.